Hello, and thank you for clicking on our YouTube channel. I'm the Director of the Education Services of United Way, and we're doing a series on our STEM Saturdays. This is STEM Lesson 3. This will be presented on November the 11th, on Saturday, November the 11th, here in our office. If you're interested in these issues or any of these things and you would like to do hands-on experiments, come and join us at noon on that day, and we're going to have a great time. But today we'll get a little bit of a preview of what we're going to look at that day, and those will be environmental issues. So I wanted first to just give the definition of environment so that we can see we're all on the same page talking about it. So the environment is the natural world, either as a whole or in a particular geographical area, especially as affected by human activity. And those are the things we're going to concentrate on: how humans affect the environment, how what we do affects technically where we live, right? So the first thing, this isn't where we live, but this is human in general, are the melting of the polar ice caps. And so what's happening as the globe warms, the polar ice caps where the glaciers are starting to melt. And as they melt, of course, they're shifting the levels of our oceans. The ocean water is rising. It's becoming it's increasing more. So that's changing the planet Earth itself. And so as that glacial ice from Greenland, Antarctica, and the Arctic islands melts, our crust beneath that surface of those land masses warps. And so the crust of the Earth is made up of plates, and the plates sort of shift and move together. It's a fluid motion. And so what's happening is as that water increases and increases, those plates of rock are starting to warp underneath there. And we can tell the differences in those plates thousands of miles even away from where the polar ice caps are. And not only is it changing, the melting of the polar ice caps is changing the environment, but what it is it's threatening the polar bears. And the polar bears live there, of course, because they're polar and they live in the poles. And it's affecting their survival, their breeding, and how their populations grow. What polar bears do is they need that ice as a platform to hunt from, and they hunt seals. So they can stand on those plates of ice from the glaciers and find the seals. That's what they eat. And consequently, as the oceans become more and more, the ice freeze over more on the summer days. So we have ice-free zones. So there's not as many places for them to go. And the polar bear breeding and survival declines below the point needed to maintain the population. We call them polar bears. Some places call them ice bears. It's the same thing. That's the same name. If you see those refer to the same organism. Polar bears have a very low reproductive rate. They only have 1 or 2 cubs per year, and they'll stay with the mother for up to 2 years. You know how sometimes around here, a deer will not stay with its mother for that long a period of time. Different animals have different periods of time that they need their mother. Even birds sometimes will just stay for days, and then the mom leaves them on their own. But the females will only breed every 3 years. So you're looking at each female having 1 or 2 cubs only every 3 years, and that's not a high reproductive rate. And so the bears, and they don't even reproduce until they're about 5 or 6 years old. So they have to make it to that age, and then there's that longer period of time that they can have their offspring. So in the spring, the mothers, they emerge from their dens to hunt the seals from the floating sea ice. And if there is no sea ice for them to get to the seals, then they're going to die off. So they are unipolar, and I underline these. Uni means one, of course, and polar, up near the pole or down near the bottom of the poles. They inhabit only the Arctic, and that's an ice-covered ocean and not the ice-covered continent of Antarctica. So if there's not enough sea ice, the seals can't even haul out onto the ice, so the polar bears can't hunt. So it's sort of a trickle-down effect. The rising of the oceans, the melting of the ice caps, not enough ice, so the polar bears can't hunt the seals, but then the seals can't go out there because there is no ice. So it sort of affects all of the populations. And just right now, they're in the process of deciding whether or not to name polar bears as a threatened species. Once you've been named as a threatened species, then that means that you're in danger of becoming extinct. So we don't want them to be named a threatened species. They're supposed to make that decision before the end of the year whether to name them a threatened species. The second way that humans can infect the environment are oil spills. Crude oil, and that's the liquid remains of ancient plants and animals, and it's a fossil fuel. And we're going to look at fossil fuels here in a little bit. That's the definition. You know, the remains of plants and animals, those are fossils. And that's used to make all kinds of fuels and fuel products. And we find it below the ground or below the ocean floor in reservoirs. That's where we find our crude oil. So they drill down. Some of you might have even seen the big rigs, pictures of them, where they're drilling under the oceans or in the ground to try to find that oil. And they pump it to the outside as crude oil and transport it to the oil companies on these big pipes or on ships or trucks or trains. And there it's processed. And those plants are called refineries. They're refining the crude oil into, it can be made into different things like petroleum, the different products of petroleum, gasoline that you use in your car, plastics, soaps, paints, any of those things are what crude oil is used for once it's refined. So when that oil is released into the ocean, sometimes it's an accident and sometimes it's not. It just depends. It creates monumental environmental damage. So the statistic I found that every year about 706 million gallons of waste oil enter the ocean, and those cause devastating consequences. So the causes, they could occur naturally if it seeps out of that line that's used to move it around or to pump it out. Sometimes the rocks erode around there and cause leaks, and so it can accidentally leak out. The most damaging oil spills that occur derive from what are called anthropogenic causes, and those are leaks and spills from the refining, handling, transporting, storage, and use of the crude oil. So you don't remember this because you're too young, but the Exxon Valdez was a huge ship that was carrying oil that wrecked up or hit something up in Alaska, and oil went everywhere, and it took months and months and months to clean it up. And so there are also intentional oil discharges. So tanker ships, what they do, the captains need to clean the ships of their tankers and wash them out. And so then sometimes they'll let that residue go directly out into the ocean. So we need to look here and we'll try to see what would happen if that to the organisms that live there once that oil is spilled on the marine life. So anywhere from a few up to thousands of animals and plants could be killed. It's not only harmful to the marine animals, like the fish and the ones that live in the sea, but other species as birds, because birds eat the fish, so it indirectly affect the birds, or the birds that live in the water. Turtles and other mammals that live in the water are also affected by the oil spills, and it destroys the insulating ability of those fur-bearing mammals like sea otters, and the water-repelling abilities of the bird's feathers. And so once they can no longer repel water, they can't insulate, then those animals suffer harm. They can even die because of those harsh elements. So not only does it get on the outside of them, but if you're living in that environment, what if you swallow the oil? What if they accidentally eat something that's been doused in oil? They can become poisoned. Or fish and shellfish can digest oil, but it causes changes in their reproduction, their growth rates, or even death. So they can actually digest it, but it changes them. Oyster, shrimp, mahi-mahi, which is a type of fish, grouper, a type of fish, swordfish, and tuna, they suffer population declines, or they become too contaminated and we can't eat them to be safely caught and eaten by their predators, including us. So if you eat tuna out of a can, I'm sure people eat swordfish, and I've eaten mahi-mahi and grouper and even these other things. If they become too contaminated, then we can't catch them and eat them because that would contaminate humans, right? The good news is that oil spills do not stay forever. Nature can help with the wind and the waves that will disperse the oil over time and move it out. And part of it will eventually evaporate. And sometimes in that water we have little microbes, things that are microscopic, and they'll start breaking that oil down. So those are a few of the good things that could happen to get rid of that oil that's destroying the environment. The third thing we want to look at is the Earth's atmosphere. And when we talk about the atmosphere, anything that's above us, up into the sky, you know, where the airplanes are, things like that, that's 78% nitrogen, about 21% 20.95% oxygen, and 0.93% argon. So this 0.93 is less than 1%. So a combo of the trace gases accounts for other than about 0.04%, these other gases that are out there, and those are our greenhouse gases. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. I gave you the chemical formula. Methane is a greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, and ozone. All of those are greenhouse gases. So let's see what they do to the environment. How do greenhouse gases affect the atmosphere, where we find them? So they allow the sunlight to shine onto Earth's surface, and then the gases such as ozone trap the heat that reflects back from the surface. So we have all of these gases out here. As the sunlight comes in and is reflected back, that heat that we get from that sun is trapped, so it doesn't go further out into the atmosphere, which is a good thing because they act like the walls of the greenhouse. And scientists tell us that the average temperature of Earth would drop from 57 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 0.4 degrees if we didn't have those greenhouse gases to trap that heat here. And so sometimes we're going to run into problems with greenhouse gases, and the problems aren't from the greenhouse gases, from other things. And we're going to look at what would cause problems with those greenhouse gases. And some of them come from natural sources such as the evaporation. Water adds water vapors in the atmosphere because water evaporates from the oceans and the streams and even the ground when it's wet. Animals and plants, we release carbon dioxide as we breathe. That's what you breathe out, right? You breathe in oxygen and out carbon dioxide. And methane is released naturally from decomposition reactions. And since the Industrial Revolution that occurred in the late 1700s to early 1800s, what people do is they release larger quantities of those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. There's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's more ozone. There are more of those. So it becomes overflow. We have way too much. And most of this CO2 comes from those fossil fuels that we talked about. Fossils are made of mostly carbon. Actually, every living thing is made of mostly carbon. And so when we burn them, we get carbon dioxide, but it's all up there. In your car, if you're burning the gas in your car, it's releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And also, we're cutting down those forests, those trees, and they contain a huge amount of carbon. And also trees produce a lot of oxygen that we need to breathe, and we're cutting them down, plus producing too much carbon dioxide. We can add the methane through livestock farming, landfills, fossil fuel production, coal mining, things that we do around here, natural gas processing, those all add methane. Our nitrous oxide comes from agriculture and fossil fuels. And then we have, it's not as big now, but in the early 80s, mid 80s, people talked about CFCs in aerosol cans, like hairspray or deodorant that's in the aerosol spray. CFC stands for chlorofluorocarbons, C, chloro, F, fluoro, C carbons. We also have hydrochlorofluorocarbons. Those are just big names to just say that those products are in those aerosol sprays. They're talking about here. And then in cooling products, like if you would charge, they used to let you go home and charge your own Freon in your car. They don't let you do that anymore. You have to take it to a place that is disposed of and then have new, because that also destroys the atmosphere. And so this greenhouse effect is causing our climates to change. We get slight increases in global temperatures. That's also causing those glaciers and ice caps to melt that we talked about in the first part. And that water drains into our oceans, and that's why our sea levels are rising. We get more precipitation and the effects of rain and snow. We've also had more tornadoes, more hurricanes, things because the planet is disturbed. And so as it becomes disturbed, it tries to reach equilibrium, which everything does. And so that's why we have those extreme changes in the weather. And so much weather is actually climate, a pattern of weather. And that so do the habitats for living things. Climates change. Animals that are adapted to a certain climate become threatened, like the polar bears or different animals, because now the climate is changing. The animal's going to have to adapt or die off. That's survival of the fittest, right? That's Darwin. And many societies depend on predictable rain patterns because they grow specific crops. And if they had always had rain that occurred in a rainy season or a certain time of the year, and now it doesn't occur, they can't grow their crops. And they're like how California had that drought for so long, for years and years and years and years, then all of a sudden they got inundated with water. There was flooding everywhere. A hurricane came ashore in California not too long ago. Very strange occurrences. Tropical diseases, they could expand their ranges into more temperate regions just because the planet's changing. Tropical, usually we think of as below the equator, right? Well, now if above the equator is becoming hotter, those things could move around because they're adapted to those temperatures and the more humidity. And so during class, we're going to discuss the things that we can do to help this problem. The last thing we want to look at is not really a problem, it's a plus. We're going to look at, in our class, solar energy, right, from the sun. So it's a renewable resource, a renewable source of power. Solar energy has an important role in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, and it mitigates climate change, and that's critical to protecting us, wildlife, and the ecosystems. So we kind of want to harness the sun's power, or harness that what we get from the sun, and that is created by a process called fusion, nuclear fusion. Here we're talking about the nucleus of an atom. Fuse means we put it together, right? So that takes place within the sun. We have protons of this hydrogen atom. So here's a hydrogen, and if you know anything about atoms, hydrogen has one proton, one neutron, one electron. The protons and the neutrons are in the nucleus. This electron's sort of spinning around out here in space. And so the protons from this hydrogen atom and this hydrogen atom come together to give us two protons, two neutrons, two electrons, and that's helium. So that's what we're getting from, that's what happens in the sun, that fusion reaction. So if you know anything even about bombs, when we did the atomic bombs, some are fusion bombs, some are fission bombs, which we take this helium atom or uranium, whatever, we'll just use helium, and we're going to take that nucleus and break it apart. There's tremendous amount of energy here when you start breaking atoms and bonds apart. This process here is called proton-proton chain reaction, the PP chain, and we have enormous amount of energy that comes from the sun. It's constantly flowing throughout our solar system, and it warms our Earth. Energy, heat, and light from the sun, they flow away in the form of electromagnetic radiation. And you might hear about electromagnetic radiation. Sometimes we abbreviate that EMR, and that's all the wavelengths of light. 30% of the solar energy that reaches Earth goes back into space. The rest of it is absorbed, and the Earth's surface radiates some of the energy back out in the form of infrared. That's just a specific wavelength of light, infrared. You ever see on those movies where they put the goggles on and they can see the heat from the people's bodies? We're emitting infrared radiation, and we're picking up on that wavelength of light. The last thing here we're going to look at just a little bit, and even in class more so, is photosynthesis. Photo means light, synthesize means to make. So plants are using light from the sun to make food. We have 6 molecules, we'll say, of carbon dioxide that we just talked about, and 6 waters, and this means light. That gives us glucose, which is a sugar, C6H12O6, and oxygen that we breathe. Then in turn, when we respire, this equation flips, and we give off carbon dioxide that the trees need to grow. So almost all of life on Earth relies on solar energy. This is directly the food for the plants, and indirectly it helps us, right? Either directly or indirectly. It's a renewable resource we talked about, and we can harvest it directly for use in homes, businesses, schools, and hospitals. You see solar panels. Sometimes in a field you'll see a bunch of solar panels to harness the sun's light. And those are called photovoltaic cells and panels that we have. They were first used, and I didn't know this when I was researching, in spacecrafts, like the International Space Station. Those solar panels, photovoltaic panels, were first used there, or in power stations. We see a lot of power plants around here, but they're not solar, right? They run on coal, usually. So if you're interested in anything that has to do with the environment and hands-on activities, we would love to have you come join us for STEM Saturday number 3. Like I already said, November 11th, noon to 2. If you would like more information or to sign up, you can call me. My name is Melissa at 304-326-7762. And please like our video and share it. And thanks for joining us.